In the world of global finance, power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it moves quietly through boardrooms, policy discussions, and decisions that shape the direction of entire economies for nearly 2 decades. One name has stood at the center of that quiet power: Jamie Dimon. To many on Wall Street, he is not simply a banker. He is a symbol of stability in an industry often defined by volatility. Politicians quote him, analysts study him, and journalists describe him as the voice of American banking. But titles like these come with expectations, and expectations create pressure. Jamie Dimon's story is not the typical rise of a mysterious financial genius. He built his reputation slowly through discipline and consistency. Colleagues describe him as intensely focused, someone who prefers facts over narratives and direct conversation over corporate polish. He does not speak like a traditional executive. His sentences are short, sometimes blunt, occasionally uncomfortable. He challenges critics openly, yet he also cultivates an image of approachability, a leader who walks through offices without formality, who listens as much as he speaks. This balance between authority and accessibility helped shape his public identity. In financial circles, simply saying Jamie is often enough. The name carries recognition across trading floors, regulatory offices, and global markets. Over time, the man and the institution, JPMorgan Chase, became almost inseparable. Yet every powerful narrative begins somewhere. Before he was considered a senior statesman of Wall Street, Dimon was a strategist, navigating an industry that rewards adaptability more than perfection. His leadership philosophy revolves around preparation, the idea that risk never disappears. It only changes form. That mindset would define his career during moments of economic turbulence, and it would later become central to the controversy that now surrounds his legacy. Because when someone is seen as the guardian of a system, people assume they see everything. The myth of omniscience, the belief that a powerful leader always knows what is happening, can be both an advantage and a burden. It builds trust during times of stability, but during controversy, it invites scrutiny. Today, as Dimon approaches what many describe as the final phase of his leadership, the narrative around him is shifting. For years, he represented calm authority during chaos. Now, questions are emerging about accountability, oversight, and the hidden costs of institutional power. To understand why these questions matter, we need to step back to the moment when Jamie Dimon's reputation transformed from respected executive to financial legend. That moment arrived during the greatest financial storm of the modern era, the crisis of 2008. Before Jamie Dimon became a symbol of stability, the financial world was moving toward one of its most dangerous turning points. The early 2000s were defined by optimism. Credit was easy, housing prices were rising, and large financial institutions were competing aggressively to expand profits. Many banks embraced complex mortgage-backed securities and leveraged products that promised high returns with seemingly manageable risk. Inside this environment, JPMorgan Chase operated differently. Jamie Dimon had just taken over as CEO in 2006. At the time, few people realized how quickly the financial landscape would change. Markets appeared strong, But beneath the surface, fragile structures were forming. Dimon's leadership style emphasized preparation and caution. He encouraged teams to question assumptions, stress-test scenarios, and avoid excessive exposure to risky assets. This approach did not make headlines in the beginning. In fact, some competitors viewed JP Morgan as overly conservative. But as the housing market began to crack and liquidity dried up, the benefits of caution became clear. By 2008, the global financial system was under immense pressure. Major institutions faced insolvency. Confidence evaporated, and panic spread across markets. Governments and central banks scrambled to prevent a total collapse. During this chaos, Jamie Dimon emerged as a central figure. JPMorgan Chase played a critical role in the rescue of Bear Stearns, a once powerful investment bank that suddenly faced bankruptcy. Working alongside the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury, JP Morgan agreed to acquire Bear Stearns in a deal designed to stabilize markets. Supporters praised Dimon's willingness to act decisively when others hesitated. Critics argued that such deals reinforced the power of large institutions, regardless of perspective. The crisis transformed Dimon's public image. Media outlets began portraying him as the last man standing on Wall Street, a leader who navigated the storm while many rivals disappeared. His calm demeanor during congressional hearings and public interviews reinforced the narrative of a steady hand, guiding a turbulent industry. But success during crisis carries a complicated legacy. While JP Morgan survived and even expanded, many Americans lost homes, jobs, and savings. The federal government injected capital into banks through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, known as TARP. JP Morgan later repaid its assistance with interest. Yet the perception of banks being rescued while ordinary citizens struggled fueled resentment across the political spectrum. This resentment gave rise to new political movements, from the Occupy Wall Street protests on the left to populist anger on the right. Protesters questioned whether the financial system favored institutions over individuals. Dimon found himself at the center of this debate, praised as a problem solver by some, criticized as a symbol of corporate power by others. Interestingly, Dimon's response to criticism was often nuanced. During one speech, he acknowledged that large institutions had failed many people, expressing sympathy for public frustration. These moments reinforced his reputation as a pragmatic leader, capable of recognizing broader social issues. At the same time, JP Morgan's growth accelerated. The bank expanded its deposit base, increased its global footprint, and invested heavily in technology and infrastructure. Over the years, assets grew into the trillions, and employee numbers climbed into the hundreds of thousands. A new headquarters rose in Manhattan, reflecting both ambition and confidence. Internally, Dimon emphasized discipline. He pushed executives to focus on risk management and long-term resilience. Analysts began referring to JP Morgan's balance sheet as a fortress, echoing Dimon's own language. Yet beneath the success story, a new challenge was quietly forming, one that had nothing to do with mortgage, securities, or market volatility. It involved a client relationship that would later become one of the most controversial topics in modern banking. At the time of the financial crisis, Jeffrey Epstein's connection to JPMorgan Chase was not widely discussed in public conversations about risk. The focus remained on markets, liquidity, and regulatory reform. But years later, as legal documents surfaced and investigations deepened, questions about that relationship would return to reshape the narrative surrounding Dimon. Leadership. The crisis of 2008 built Jamie Dimon's legend, established him as a figure capable of navigating uncertainty with discipline and adaptability. Yet, the very traits that elevated his status, his reputation for oversight, his attention to detail, his role as a guardian of the system, would eventually make the next controversy far more complicated. Because when a leader is credited with seeing risks before others do, people naturally ask what risks might have been overlooked. And as JP Morgan entered a new era of expansion, the story moved away from market collapse and toward something far more personal: the question of knowledge, responsibility, and the limits of leadership. Long before Jamie Dimon's reputation faced political pressure or public scrutiny, a quieter story existed inside the structure of global banking. The relationship between powerful financial institutions and their wealthiest clients. One of those clients was Jeffrey Epstein. For years, Epstein moved within elite financial and social circles. He was known as a wealthy financier who managed money for high-net-worth individuals. Behind that image, however, were legal troubles that would later reshape public perception of everyone connected to him. JPMorgan Chase maintained a banking relationship with Epstein from the late 1990s until 2013. During that time, he was not treated as an ordinary customer. He belonged to the private banking division, a part of the institution designed to serve ultra-wealthy clients with personalized services and close executive relationships. At first glance, such relationships are common in global finance. Large banks compete intensely to attract influential clients, offering tailored financial solutions and access to exclusive networks. But years later, legal filings revealed something more complex. Internal reports showed that thousands of transactions linked to Epstein's accounts had been flagged as suspicious activity. Some payments reportedly involved transfers to women in multiple countries, and hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through international banking channels. These details did not immediately create a public crisis for JP Morgan. Many such compliance concerns remain internal unless they escalate into criminal proceedings. Everything changed when Epstein's arrest in 2019 brought renewed attention to his past as investigations unfolded. Lawsuits against JPMorgan Chase argued that the bank had ignored warning signs about Epstein's behavior. Legal teams examined internal communications, executive decisions, and the structure of oversight within the organization. In May 2023, Jamie Dimon sat for a sworn deposition. Related to these cases, one question became central to the controversy. When did he first learn that Epstein was a client of his bank? Dimon's answer was direct. He said he did not recall knowing anything about Epstein until media reports surfaced in 2019. The statement appeared clear, yet it triggered immediate debate. Supporters of Dimon pointed out that CEOs of massive institutions cannot personally track every client relationship. JP Morgan employs hundreds of thousands of people across multiple divisions, and private banking operations often function with a high level of internal autonomy. Critics, however, saw the situation differently. Jamie Dimon's reputation has long been built on deep involvement in the details of his organization. Colleagues frequently describe him as someone who goes several layers down, asking precise questions and demanding thorough explanations. Because of that image, some observers found it difficult to reconcile his claim of limited awareness with the scale of Epstein's presence within the bank. Adding complexity were statements from other executives. A former senior leader suggested that discussions involving Epstein may have occurred years earlier. Documents indicated that certain high-level managers were aware of Epstein's legal history, including his earlier conviction. The bank's official position remained firm. Spokespeople stated that Dimon never dealt directly with Epstein, never met him, and was not involved in managing his accounts. They emphasized that appearing in investigative files or legal documents does not imply wrongdoing. This distinction is essential. The Epstein controversy surrounding JP Morgan is not a criminal accusation against Jamie Dimon personally. Instead, it raises a broader question about leadership responsibility inside massive institutions. How much should a CEO know? And when problems emerge, does the public judge leaders based on direct involvement or based on the culture and oversight they create? The issue extends beyond one individual. Modern global banks operate like vast ecosystems. Decisions flow through layers of management, compliance teams, and regulatory frameworks. Yet when controversy arises, attention often focuses on a single figure at the top. That dynamic can transform a corporate issue into a personal narrative. For Jamie Dimon, the Epstein files introduced a tension between two powerful identities. On one side, he remained the crisis-tested leader, credited with strengthening JP Morgan's stability. On the other, he faced questions about whether the institution he guided had overlooked warning signs tied to one of the most notorious financial clients in recent history. Public reaction reflected this divide. Some analysts argued that the controversy represented a reputational risk rather than a legal threat. Others believed it highlighted a deeper issue within global finance: the challenge of balancing profit incentives with ethical oversight. The deposition itself offered a glimpse into Dimon's perspective. He expressed horror at the crimes associated with Epstein and suggested that he would personally apologize to victims if the bank's actions contributed to delayed reporting. Statements like these showed empathy, yet they did not fully quiet the debate, because in the world of public perception, uncertainty can be as powerful as proof. And as media coverage expanded, another force began shaping the narrative: the intersection of banking and politics. The controversy was no longer confined to courtrooms or financial analysts. Political figures began to reference the Epstein files, linking them to broader debates about accountability, elite power, and the role of large institutions in American society. For a leader approaching the final phase of his career, the timing could not have been more significant. The next chapter of Jamie Dimon's story would move beyond internal banking questions and into a far more unpredictable arena: the political battlefield. In modern finance, reputation is shaped not only by markets, but by politics. For a figure like Jamie Dimon, whose influence stretches beyond banking, the political climate can become just as important as balance sheets and quarterly earnings. As the Epstein controversy gained attention, it did not remain confined to legal discussions. Instead, it entered a broader narrative about elite institutions and public accountability. A narrative that has defined American politics for more than a decade across the political spectrum. Distrust of powerful organizations has grown steadily. On the left, critics argue that large banks concentrate wealth and influence. On the right, populist movements often portray financial leaders as disconnected from ordinary citizens. In this environment, even a hint of controversy can become symbolic of deeper frustrations. Jamie Dimon has long navigated this tension. Unlike many executives who avoid public commentary, he frequently speaks on economic policy, global trade, and the direction of American leadership. His annual letters to shareholders often read less like corporate updates and more like reflections on geopolitics and society. This willingness to engage publicly elevated his profile, but it also exposed him to political crossfire. One of the most striking developments during this period was the involvement of former President Donald Trump. The relationship between Trump and Dimon has always been complicated. At times, they appeared cooperative, meeting to discuss economic issues and financial regulation. At other moments, their disagreements became personal and public. When political pressure began to build around the Epstein files, Trump called for prosecutors to examine JPMorgan's ties to Epstein more closely. Around the same time, legal disputes between Trump and the bank intensified, ended its business relationship with him following the events at the U.S. Capitol in January 2021. Trump's lawsuit against the bank added a new dimension to the narrative. What had begun as a discussion about corporate oversight now intersected with broader political conflict. Supporters of Trump framed the situation as evidence of political bias within financial institutions. Others viewed the lawsuit as part of a larger strategy of challenging corporate power. For Jamie Dimon, this environment required careful balance. He has often positioned himself as a pragmatic figure, someone willing to work with leaders across political lines. Even when he criticizes policies, he tends to avoid direct personal attacks, focusing instead on economic consequences. This strategy reflects a deeper philosophy. Dimon is often described as an accommodator, a leader who adapts to changing realities rather than clinging to rigid ideological positions. Over the years, he has adjusted his bank's approach to emerging trends, including cryptocurrencies, diversity initiatives, and global partnerships. Yet adaptability can be interpreted in different ways. Supporters see it as evidence of strategic flexibility. Critics argue that it reflects a willingness to align with whichever political environment dominates at a given moment. Political atmosphere surrounding the Epstein controversy intensified scrutiny of Dimon's leadership style. Lawmakers from different parties emphasized the need for accountability within large financial institutions. Some questioned whether executives should bear responsibility for decisions made deep within complex organizational structures. Senators and members of Congress publicly discussed the issue, highlighting the symbolic significance of Epstein's status as a high-profile client. They argued that institutions serving ultra-wealthy individuals carry an additional burden to detect and prevent misconduct. Meanwhile, allies of Dimon emphasized his long history of cooperation with regulators and policymakers. They pointed to his role during economic crises and his willingness to engage in policy discussions of a broader commitment to stability. This clash of perspectives created a challenging environment in the past. Dimon's public image benefited from a perception of neutrality, a banker respected by both Democrats and Republicans. But as populist rhetoric intensified, maintaining that balance became increasingly difficult. Every statement, every policy adjustment, and every legal development became part of a larger narrative about power and influence. And behind the headlines, a deeper question began to emerge. Was Jamie Dimon being judged for specific actions, or was he becoming a symbol of a financial system that many people no longer trusted? The distinction matters, because when an individual becomes a symbol, the debate moves beyond facts into perception. Political narratives often simplify complex realities, framing issues in terms of heroes and villains rather than nuanced institutional challenges. Navigating this landscape required not only strategic communication, but also emotional resilience, the same qualities that helped him lead during economic crises: calmness under pressure, adaptability, and pragmatic decision-making were now being tested in a different arena. The Epstein controversy did not create this political tension. Instead, it amplified an existing dynamic in which financial leaders operate under constant scrutiny from both sides of the ideological spectrum. And as the pressure grew, observers began to examine another aspect of Dimon's legacy: the contrast between his carefully crafted public image and the realities of managing the most powerful bank in America. In the modern financial world, leadership is not only about strategy and numbers. It is also about perception. A CEO's public image can shape how investors, regulators, and even employees interpret every decision. For Jamie Dimon, this image has long been one of confidence, clarity, and authority, the approachable executive who speaks plainly while guiding one of the most complex institutions on earth. Yet, public images are rarely simple reflections of reality. Over the years, Dimon has cultivated a reputation that goes beyond banking. He writes annual shareholder letters that read like global economic essays. He comments on geopolitics, technology, and social change, positioning himself as a thinker rather than just a corporate manager. Media interviews often portray him as an all-purpose voice of reason, someone capable of explaining both financial markets and the broader direction of society. This visibility strengthened his influence. Journalists frequently described him as a senior statesman of Wall Street, someone who could speak for an entire industry. During times of uncertainty, his words carried weight, sometimes moving markets or shaping political discussions. But visibility has a hidden cost. The more a leader becomes associated with wisdom and foresight, the more people expect consistency between words and actions. When controversies emerge, observers revisit past statements, searching for contradictions or signs of hypocrisy. The Epstein controversy highlighted this tension sharply. In one setting, Dimon described himself as someone deeply informed about the details of his organization. Colleagues often praised his habit of diving into operational layers, asking precise questions, and challenging assumptions. This image of hyper-awareness became central to his leadership myth. At the same time, during his deposition, he emphasized limited knowledge about Epstein's status as a client. For supporters, these positions are not contradictory. A CEO cannot monitor every account within a massive institution. Delegation is necessary, and private banking operations often function with specialized teams handling sensitive relationships. But for critics, the contrast raises questions. If Dimon is known for understanding every corner of the bank, how could such a significant relationship remain outside his awareness? The issue is not legal guilt, it is narrative consistency. This is where media portrayal becomes important. High-profile interviews and profiles have sometimes presented Dimon in a positive, almost admiring light. Television segments have explored his leadership philosophy without deeply challenging controversial topics. Critics argue that such portrayals contribute to a mythic image that shields powerful figures from tougher scrutiny. The relationship between media and influential leaders is complex. Access to executives often depends on trust, and trust can shape the tone of coverage. When journalists gain extended interviews, they may present a more humanized version of their subjects, highlighting personality, humor, or personal stories alongside professional achievements. For viewers, this creates a layered perception. On one level, Jamie Dimon appears as a pragmatic executive who values efficiency and resilience. On another, he becomes a cultural figure, a symbol of stability in a volatile world. Yet symbols invite reinterpretation as new information emerges. Audiences reassess earlier narratives. What once looked like confident leadership may later appear as calculated messaging. What seemed like transparency might be seen as selective disclosure. This process is not unique to Dimon. Many leaders experience shifts in public perception as circumstances change. But because his identity is so closely tied to JPMorgan's success, any challenge to his image feels amplified. Inside the organization, Dimon's leadership style remains influential. Employees describe him as demanding but fair, someone who expects discipline and accountability. Analysts often note that he combines toughness with moments of reconciliation, challenging critics publicly, then reaching out privately to rebuild relationships. This duality reflects a deeper psychological strategy. Strong leaders often balance authority with relatability. They project confidence while maintaining enough openness to build loyalty. Over time, this balance shapes organizational culture, influencing how employees respond to risk and controversy. However, culture alone cannot protect against reputational storms. The Epstein files forced observers to examine not only the actions of individuals but also the broader environment within elite financial institutions. Questions about oversight, ethical responsibility, and decision-making processes became part of the public conversation. For Dimon, the challenge was not simply to defend his actions, but to reconcile two identities. The legendary leader, celebrated for foresight, and the executive facing scrutiny over events that unfolded within his own institution. As debates intensified, another dimension of his leadership came into focus: the structure of power inside JPMorgan itself, because beyond media narratives and political pressure lies a deeper question: who, if anyone, truly holds a leader accountable when they sit at the very top? Leadership inside a global bank is not only about strategy, it is also about structure. Titles, committees, and governance frameworks define how decisions move through the organization. In theory, modern corporations are built on systems of checks and balances, designed to prevent any single individual from holding unchecked power. But in practice, influence can concentrate around strong personalities. Jamie Dimon has served not only as CEO of JPMorgan Chase, but also as chairman of its board for many years. This dual role places him in a uniquely powerful position. As CEO, he oversees daily operations and long-term strategy. As chairman, he helps guide the board that evaluates those strategies. Supporters argue that this structure creates efficiency. A unified leadership voice allows the organization to move quickly, especially during crises. Dimon's experience during the financial meltdown of 2008 reinforced the idea that decisive leadership can stabilize institutions when uncertainty spreads. Critics, however, question whether such concentration of authority limits independent oversight. Corporate governance experts often debate whether the roles of CEO and chairman should be separated. When one person occupies both positions, the risk exists that internal challenges become less visible or less frequent. Board members may rely heavily on the CEO's perspective, especially when that CEO has built a reputation for success over many years inside JPMorgan. Analysts and former insiders have sometimes described Dimon as operating with significant autonomy. He is known for making strong decisions and standing firmly behind them. For many employees, this creates clarity, a sense that leadership direction is consistent and predictable. Yet, autonomy can also create distance. In a vast organization with hundreds of thousands of employees, information flows upward through layers of management. Each layer filters data, prioritizes issues, and frames risks differently. Even the most engaged CEO relies on these channels to understand what is happening across divisions. The Epstein controversy raised questions about how information traveled within JPMorgan's hierarchy. Senior executives were aware of risks associated with certain clients. How were those concerns communicated? Were they escalated to the highest level or managed internally within specific departments? And more broadly, what does effective oversight look like when an institution operates at such enormous scale? These questions extend beyond one individual. They reflect a broader challenge in modern finance, balancing growth with accountability. Large banks thrive on complex relationships with clients, governments, and global markets. Managing these relationships requires trust in specialized teams. Yet, that trust can sometimes obscure early warning signs. Observers often note that Dimon's leadership style emphasizes resilience and preparation. He speaks frequently about the importance of building strong capital reserves, maintaining liquidity, and anticipating future crises. In many ways, JPMorgan's stability during economic shocks reflects this philosophy. However, risk does not always appear in the form of financial instability. Reputational risk, the damage caused by public perception, can emerge slowly, growing from events that initially seem isolated. Unlike market crashes, which demand immediate action, reputational challenges evolve through narratives, media coverage, and political debate. The governance structure of JP Morgan becomes especially relevant in this context. Board members are responsible for overseeing the CEO's performance, evaluating strategy, and ensuring that the organization maintains ethical standards. According to company representatives, the board operates independently and monitors leadership decisions closely. Yet critics sometimes argue that long tenures can blur boundaries between oversight and loyalty. When a leader achieves consistent success, directors may hesitate to challenge established practices. Over time, institutional culture can prioritize continuity over confrontation. This dynamic does not necessarily indicate wrongdoing. Instead, it highlights the complexity of managing power within large organizations. Jamie Dimon's leadership has often been described as both authoritative and adaptable. He is willing to change course when circumstances demand it, embracing new technologies, adjusting policies, and responding to shifting political landscapes. But adaptability also raises questions about consistency. How does a leader maintain clear ethical standards while navigating constant change? The Epstein files intensified these debates. They prompted analysts to examine not only specific decisions, but also the broader systems that allowed certain relationships to continue for years. Some observers viewed the controversy as evidence that even the strongest governance structures can struggle to identify risks hidden within complex networks. Others argued that expecting a single executive to oversee every detail of a global bank is unrealistic. Between these perspectives lies a deeper truth about modern leadership. Power is rarely absolute, but responsibility often feels personal. As discussions about oversight continued, attention turned toward another dimension of Dimon's legacy: the challenge of succession. After more than 2 decades at the top, the question of who might replace him began to carry new urgency. Because, in the final phase of a leader's career, decisions about the future can shape how history remembers the past. Every long leadership story eventually reaches a turning point, a moment when attention shifts from past achievements to the question of what comes next. For Jamie Dimon, that moment is no longer theoretical. After more than 2 decades as CEO of JPMorgan Chase, discussions about succession have become an essential part of how analysts, investors, and employees view his final chapter in corporate history. The transition from a dominant leader to a new generation is rarely simple. The longer a CEO remains in power, the more closely the organization's identity becomes tied to that individual. In the case of JPMorgan, Dimon's leadership has shaped everything from risk strategy to public messaging. The bank's culture, structure, and reputation have grown alongside his own. This creates a paradox. On one hand, stability is reassuring. Investors often prefer continuity, especially when a company has performed strongly under a particular leader. On the other hand, extended tenure raises concerns about whether an institution can thrive independently once that leader steps aside. The idea of a last act has appeared frequently in discussions about Dimon's future. Approaching his 70s, he has publicly acknowledged that he will eventually hand over the role of CEO. Yet he has also suggested that he may remain involved as chairman or advisor, ensuring that his influence continues during the transition. Succession planning inside JPMorgan is often described as deliberate and strategic. Several senior executives have been mentioned as potential successors, though the bank has consistently avoided confirming any official shortlist. Among them are leaders who have spent years working closely with Dimon, absorbing his approach to risk, management, and decision-making. This continuity is intentional. Dimon's leadership philosophy emphasizes preparation. Just as he prepares for financial crises, he also prepares for organizational change. Developing future leaders ensures that the bank's culture does not shift abruptly when the time comes for transition. Yet, succession becomes more complicated when controversy enters the picture. The Epstein files, political pressure, and ongoing debates about oversight have added a new layer of uncertainty to Dimon's final years as CEO. Even if these issues do not result in legal consequences, they influence public perception, and perception shapes legacy. Legacy is not only about numbers or profits, it is about narrative, the story that remains when a leader's tenure ends. For decades, Jamie Dimon's narrative has centered on resilience, strategic patience, and the ability to navigate crises. Supporters highlight his role during the financial meltdown, his influence in stabilizing markets, and his willingness to engage with policymakers during moments of uncertainty. Critics, however, see a more complex picture. They argue that the concentration of power within large banks creates systemic risks, regardless of individual leadership qualities. For them, the Epstein controversy symbolizes broader issues within elite financial institutions, the challenge of balancing profit with ethical responsibility. These competing narratives make the question of succession even more significant. Follows Dimon will inherit not only a powerful institution but also the expectations shaped by his leadership style. Analysts wonder whether JPMorgan can maintain its reputation as a fortress without the figure who built that image. Some economists have expressed skepticism, suggesting that the bank's success may be too closely tied to one individual. Others believe that JPMorgan's scale and infrastructure will ensure continuity regardless of leadership changes inside the organization. Employees face a different challenge. Leadership transitions can create uncertainty about strategy, culture, and long-term direction. Will the next CEO maintain Dimon's pragmatic approach? Will they adopt a more cautious stance toward controversial clients or political engagement? Or will they redefine the bank's identity entirely? For Jamie Dimon himself, succession represents both an opportunity and a risk. If handled well, it can reinforce his legacy as a leader who prepared his institution for the future. If mismanaged, it could overshadow decades of achievement, leaving observers focused on instability rather than success. History offers many examples of powerful executives whose final years defined how they were remembered. Sometimes the last chapter carries more weight than everything that came before. The choices made during this period about leadership, communication, and accountability can shape the narrative that endures long after the individual steps away. As the conversation around Dimon's future intensified, another debate emerged, one that extended beyond succession and into the structure of the financial system itself. Because behind every individual story lies a larger question. What happens when a bank becomes so large, so influential, that its success is seen as essential to the stability of the entire economy? In the language of modern finance, few phrases carry as much weight as "too big to fail." It is more than a technical description. It is a reflection of how deeply certain institutions are woven into the structure of the global economy. For JPMorgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States, this label has followed the organization throughout Jamie Dimon's leadership. The idea itself emerged strongly during the financial crisis of 2008. Governments faced a painful dilemma: allow massive banks to collapse and risk economic chaos, or step in with support and risk reinforcing the belief that large institutions would always be rescued. JPMorgan Chase survived that era stronger than most of its competitors. Under Dimon's leadership, the bank expanded its assets, increased its deposit base, and built a reputation for resilience. Today, it operates across nearly every corner of the financial universe: retail banking, investment services, private wealth management, credit markets, and global trading. Supporters argue that this scale represents strength. Diversified institution can absorb shocks that might destroy smaller competitors. Dimon often speaks about maintaining a fortress balance sheet, emphasizing capital reserves and liquidity as shields against uncertainty. During periods of market stress, JPMorgan has even stepped in to help stabilize failing institutions, reinforcing the perception that it acts as a guardian of the financial system. Yet critics see the same scale as a source of risk. When an institution becomes deeply interconnected with markets, its potential failure becomes unthinkable. Governments and regulators may feel compelled to intervene, creating what economists call moral hazard. If investors believe that a bank will always be saved, they may underestimate risks, encouraging aggressive behavior. Across the industry, Jamie Dimon has publicly rejected the label "too big to fail," arguing that regulatory reforms and stronger capital standards have changed the landscape since the financial crisis. He insists that JPMorgan operates responsibly and prepares constantly for potential disruptions. But many experts remain skeptical. They point out that the concentration of deposits and assets within a handful of institutions gives those banks enormous influence over economic outcomes. JPMorgan alone holds trillions of dollars in assets and serves millions of customers worldwide. Its decisions ripple through credit markets, government debt trading, and international investment flows. The Epstein controversy intersects with this debate in a subtle way. While the legal questions focus on a specific client relationship, The broader issue is institutional accountability. When a bank becomes central to the functioning of the financial system, expectations for oversight increase dramatically. Observers ask whether profit incentives sometimes overshadow ethical considerations, especially in high-value private banking relationships. At the same time, JP Morgan's growth has been fueled by strategic patience during moments of crisis. Regulators have occasionally allowed large banks to acquire failing competitors, despite laws designed to limit concentration. These exceptions reflect a pragmatic reality. When stability is threatened, authorities often turn to the strongest institutions for support. This dynamic reinforces the perception of power. For Jamie Dimon, being at the center of such a system brings both prestige and pressure. On one hand, he is praised as a leader capable of navigating complex markets. On the other, he becomes a symbol of the very concentration that many critics oppose. The debate extends beyond economics into philosophy. Should modern societies rely on massive institutions to maintain stability? Or should they encourage fragmentation to reduce systemic risk? There is no easy answer. Large banks provide efficiency and global connectivity, but their size can also create vulnerabilities that are difficult to control. Inside JP Morgan, leadership emphasizes preparation. Executives stress test scenarios ranging from economic downturns to geopolitical shocks. Dimon himself often speaks about uncertainty, warning that future crises may come from unexpected directions. Yet risk does not always appear as a market crash. Reputational challenges, political pressure, and evolving public expectations can reshape an institution's trajectory just as dramatically as financial losses. The Epstein files illustrate how issues unrelated to traditional market risk can influence perceptions of stability. As debates about too big to fail continue, another aspect of Dimon's leadership becomes visible: his role as a public thinker. Through speeches, interviews, and shareholder letters, he has positioned himself not only as a banker, but as a commentator on the future of global economics. This raises a final question for observers. When a CEO becomes a voice on national and international policy, does that strengthen the institution's influence? Or does it blur the line between corporate leadership and political power? The answer may shape how Jamie Dimon's final years are remembered, especially as he navigates the intersection of business strategy, public perception, and historical legacy. As Jamie Dimon's career evolved, his role began to extend far beyond the traditional responsibilities of a bank executive. He was no longer just managing balance sheets or overseeing trading floors. Through speeches, interviews, and annual shareholder letters, he positioned himself as a commentator on the direction of economies, governments, and society itself. This transformation did not happen overnight. Early in his tenure, Dimon's public image focused primarily on operational leadership, discipline, risk management, and strategic growth. But as JP Morgan expanded and his reputation solidified, media outlets increasingly turned to him for broader perspectives. Questions about global trade, technological change, and political polarization became part of his public conversations. He began to sound less like a corporate manager and more like a philosopher of modern capitalism. His shareholder letters often stretched far beyond financial performance. They addressed geopolitical tensions, the future of work, and the need for stronger global cooperation. Observers sometimes described his tone as Olympian, suggesting that he spoke from a vantage point above the everyday struggles of markets and politics. Supporters admired this ambition. They saw Dimon as a rare leader, willing to think long-term, someone who used his platform to encourage thoughtful debate rather than short-term market reactions. In an industry often criticized for narrow focus on profits, his willingness to discuss social and economic issues appeared refreshing. Critics, however, questioned whether this expanded role blurred important boundaries. When a CEO of a powerful financial institution comments on public policy, those statements carry weight. They can influence investor expectations, political narratives, and even regulatory discussions. Some analysts wondered whether Dimon's public voice represented personal conviction or strategic positioning designed to strengthen JPMorgan's influence. The Epstein controversy added complexity to this dynamic in interviews. Dimon has expressed strong opinions about ethical risks within financial systems, including concerns about money laundering and illicit activity. These statements reflect a broader commitment to stability and compliance. Yet, when critics compared these views to the history of Epstein's relationship with JPMorgan, they highlighted the tension between ideals and institutional realities. Contrast illustrates a deeper psychological challenge for leaders who operate in public view. The more a figure speaks about values and principles, the more audiences expect alignment between rhetoric and action. Even small inconsistencies can appear significant when magnified by media attention. Dimon's communication style contributes to this perception. He often speaks in confident, decisive language, offering clear judgments about economic trends or policy decisions. This directness reinforces his authority, but it also invites scrutiny. When statements from different moments seem inconsistent, observers interpret them as evidence of shifting priorities. Yet adaptability has always been central to his leadership philosophy. Throughout his career, Dimon has adjusted his positions in response to changing realities. He has criticized certain financial innovations, while later allowing customers to access them. He has supported social initiatives during periods of cultural change, then recalibrated corporate messaging as political winds shifted. This flexibility reflects pragmatic leadership, the ability to balance personal views with the needs of a complex organization. For critics, it raises questions about authenticity and consistency. The role of a philosopher, CEO, is inherently risky. By engaging with broad societal issues, a leader invites debate that extends beyond business performance. Every comment becomes part of a larger narrative about power, influence, and responsibility. Portrayals amplify this effect. Long-form interviews often present Dimon as a calm and thoughtful voice, someone capable of explaining complex topics in accessible language. These portrayals strengthen his image as a trusted authority. At the same time, they create expectations that he will address difficult questions directly. Expectations that can be challenging to meet when controversies arise. Inside JPMorgan, employees watch these public appearances closely. Leadership messaging influences internal culture, shaping how teams think about risk, innovation, and ethics. When a CEO frames global events as opportunities for learning rather than threats, it can foster resilience throughout the organization. But public influence comes with long-term consequences as Dimon approaches the final phase of his tenure. His words and actions are increasingly viewed through the lens of legacy. Analysts ask whether his public philosophy will define how history remembers him as a visionary who expanded the role of corporate leadership, or as a powerful executive navigating the complexities of modern capitalism. This reflection leads naturally to the final chapter of the story, because legacy is never written solely by achievements or controversies. It is shaped by the balance between them, the narrative that emerges when a leader's career is viewed as a whole. And for Jamie Dimon, that narrative now stands at a crossroads.